On November 2, 1907, at 9 a.m. on a Saturday, the President of the United States had 45 minutes to decide whether to let a private banker break federal law. He said yes. What that banker acquired in those 45 minutes stayed out of the history books for decades. The banker was J.P. Morgan. The law he broke was the Sherman Antitrust Act, and what he walked away with was a steel and coal empire worth several $100 million, purchased for $39 million. During a national emergency with presidential immunity, you've heard that J.P. Morgan saved America in 1907, that when banks collapsed and panic spread, one man stepped in, organized a rescue, and stopped the crash. That's not wrong, but it's only the last chapter. What the textbooks leave out is what Morgan did while he was saving America. Which banks he chose not to save, which competitors he let fail, and what he purchased at the exact moment no one was watching. This is not the story of a rescue. This is the story of how one man turned a national emergency into the largest corporate acquisition in American history, what it cost ordinary Americans, and why the institution built to prevent it from ever happening, again, was designed by the same private banking network that profited from it. To understand what Morgan actually did, you have to start 3 weeks before the panic, with a man named Augustus Heinze. Heinze was what they called a copper king. He had made his first fortune in the mines of Butte, Montana. By 1907, he had moved to New York, and he believed he had found a way to make his second fortune in a single week. His plan was a short squeeze on United Copper stock. The mechanics were simple. Heinze believed he and his brothers owned the majority of United Copper's outstanding shares. If they could force short sellers to buy back borrowed stock, all at once, the price would spike. The short sellers would have no choice but to pay whatever Heinze demanded. On October 14, 1907, the Heinze brothers began buying. United Copper went from $39 a share to $60 in a single trading session. Then everything went wrong. The short sellers found shares elsewhere, from brokers the Heinze brothers had not anticipated. The squeeze failed. United Copper crashed from $60 to $10 in 48 hours. Otto Heinze's brokerage firm was wiped out on the morning of October 16th. Under normal circumstances, a failed stock scheme would have stayed on Wall Street. But Augustus Heinze was not just a speculator. He was connected. His associate, Charles Morse, known as the Ice King for his monopoly on New York's ice supply, sat on the boards of 6 banks. When Morse's name appeared in the papers alongside the Heinze collapse, depositors started asking questions. Specifically, they started asking about the Knickerbocker Trust Company. The Knickerbocker was not a small institution. It was the third largest trust company in New York. It held deposits from 17,000 account holders. Its president, Charles Barney, was a prominent socialite who had done business with Morse. That association was enough. On October 22nd, the run began. In 3 hours, depositors withdrew $8 million in cash. The Knickerbocker ran out of money at noon. And this is where J.P. Morgan enters the story. Not as a bystander. Not as a reluctant hero summoned to duty. Morgan had been watching the situation develop for weeks. He was 70 years old. He had lived through 6 financial panics. And he understood something that most people watching the Knickerbocker run did not. A crisis, properly managed, is an opportunity. Before we continue, one question for you. In 2008, the U.S. government bailed out the banks that caused the financial crisis. Most people accepted that there was no alternative. If you already knew that pattern started in 1907, drop a $sign in the comments. I want to know how far down this rabbit hole you've already been. Now, here is what Morgan actually did, and what history textbooks consistently leave out. Morgan convened his rescue operation at his private library on 36th Street. He summoned the senior bankers of New York. He sent Benjamin Strong, a vice president at Bankers Trust and his trusted lieutenant, to examine the Knickerbocker's books. Strong spent one night reviewing the accounts. His conclusion: he could not confirm the Knickerbocker was solvent. Morgan accepted that conclusion and refused to save the Knickerbocker. The third largest trust company in New York was left to fail. Charles Barney, the man who ran it, shot himself in November. Now, Morgan saved other institutions. That is true. He organized $10 million in emergency loans to the Trust Company of America. He personally guaranteed $25 million to prevent the New York Stock Exchange from suspending trading. The collapse was contained, but it was contained in a very specific way. The institutions Morgan chose not to save were, in many cases, the ones whose failure eliminated his competitors. The institutions he chose to save were the ones his network controlled. And here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable. On the morning of Saturday, November 2, 1907, two men boarded a night train from New York to Washington. Their names were Elbert Gary and Henry Clay Frick. They represented the United States Steel Corporation, the company J.P. Morgan had built 6 years earlier into the world's first billion-dollar corporation. They needed to speak to Theodore Roosevelt. Before the market opened, their request was direct. There was a brokerage firm called Moore & Schley. It was about to collapse. Moore & Schley had borrowed heavily against 6 million shares of Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, a large steel and mineral conglomerate based in Alabama. As the panic deepened, those shares had lost most of their value. Moore & Schley was insolvent. Gary and Frick told Roosevelt the only way to prevent Moore & Schley from dragging more institutions down was for U.S. Steel to purchase Tennessee Coal. There was one problem. United States Steel already controlled 60% of America's steel market. Theodore Roosevelt had built his entire political identity around busting exactly this kind of monopoly. Acquiring Tennessee Coal would push U.S. Steel's market share even higher. It was a clear violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Roosevelt had 45 minutes to decide. The market opened at 10 a.m. He approved the acquisition. U.S. Steel purchased Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company for approximately $39 million. Historians have since argued extensively about what Tennessee Coal was actually worth. The company controlled some of the richest iron ore and coal deposits in the American South. Conservative estimates put its true value at several $100 million, with some analysis placing it higher. Morgan's U.S. Steel had just acquired a transformative industrial asset. At panic prices, with presidential immunity from antitrust prosecution, and Morgan himself, who orchestrated the deal, never entered a single government building. He stayed in his library. He sent Gary and Frick. He maintained the image of the reluctant patriot, forced into public service by a national emergency. The Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation that would convene 5 years. Later in 1912, would establish that Morgan and his associates sat on the boards of 112 corporations with a combined capitalization of over $22 billion. They controlled the banking system they had just saved. If this kind of analysis is what you came here for, this is what we do on this channel, every video. There's significantly more where this came from, a step back from the boardrooms and the libraries. While Morgan and his associates were managing the crisis from private libraries and overnight trains, the American public was absorbing the consequences of decisions made by men they had never elected. The New York Stock Exchange lost 50% of its peak value in 1907. Businesses that had borrowed against stock collateral found their credit destroyed overnight. Factories closed. Payrolls were missed. Charles Barney, the president of the Knickerbocker Trust, had not caused the panic. He had a social connection to Charles Morse. That was enough. Morgan's team looked at his books for one night and declined to support him. Barney lost his position. Then he lost everything. He died by his own hand on November 14, 1907. Augustus Heinze, whose failed Copper Corner had triggered the initial panic, was prosecuted. He was charged with fraud and bank misappropriation. He lost his fortune. He died broke in 1914. Charles Morse, the Ice King, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The men who set off the crisis faced consequences. The man who managed it emerged richer. By the end of 1907, U.S. Steel, Morgan's creation, had absorbed Tennessee Coal and Iron. It now controlled an even larger share of American steel production. The acquisition that antitrust law was supposed to prevent had been executed under the cover of a national emergency. With presidential authorization, and with almost no public scrutiny, Roosevelt would later say he regretted approving the deal. He said he had been deceived about Tennessee Coal's true value. He said Gary and Frick had not been fully transparent with him. Perhaps, but the deal stood, and U.S. Steel kept Tennessee Coal for decades. Let's step back and look at what we actually know. Augustus Heinze's failed copper scheme destabilized trust in several New York banks. Morgan, who had been planning responses to financial panics for decades, moved quickly. He established himself as the singular authority to decide which institutions would survive. He let a competitor's bank fail while organizing liquidity for banks connected to his own network. He then used the ongoing crisis to execute an acquisition that antitrust law prohibited, with immunity negotiated. Directly from the president in a 45-minute meeting on a Saturday morning. 3 years later, in November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich, the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., organized a secret trip to Jekyll Island, Georgia, so the men who attended used only first names. They were there to draft what would become the Federal Reserve Act. Among the architects of that plan, Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Henry Davison of Bankers Trust, Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank, and Benjamin Strong, the same man. Morgan had sent to examine the Knickerbocker's books in 1907. Strong would become the first president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I want to be precise here. This is an analysis of financial systems and institutional power, not an indictment of any individual, group, or family. The decisions made in 1907 and 1910 were made by specific institutions and the individuals who ran them. The historical record does not require conspiracy theories. It requires careful reading of documented events. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913, officially to prevent future panics from depending on a single individual. In 2008, the Federal Reserve deployed trillions of dollars to prevent the collapse of the same class of institutions it was designed to regulate. The banks that received emergency support in 2008 emerged from the crisis larger and more concentrated than when they entered it. The pattern Morgan established in 1907, crisis management that simultaneously eliminates competition and expands its market share, did not end in 1907. And the institution that bears his name today, J.P. Morgan Chase, remains the largest bank in the United States. The verdict on the panic of 1907, J.P. Morgan did not cause the panic, but he was prepared for it. And the evidence suggests that the men best positioned to manage the crisis were also the men best positioned to profit from it, and that the Federal Reserve, built in response to that crisis, was designed by the same private banking network that Morgan commanded. That is not a conspiracy. That is the documented record. Next, we're looking at the Jekyll Island meeting itself, the 9 days in 1910 when 6 men using only first names drafted the system that controls the money in your pocket today. If you made it this far, you already know more than most. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.